The rain had been falling since noon, and by the time the taxi pulled away, it was the kind of cold that doesn't apologize. She stood at the end of the driveway with one suitcase, a brown Samsonite that had been to Niagara Falls in 1971 and hadn't traveled since. The house rose behind her, dark in most of its windows, the porch light already off though it wasn't yet 5 o'clock. She could see the shadow of her daughter-in-law moving behind the kitchen curtain. The curtain did not part. Eleanor Granger, 77 years old, white-haired and steady on her feet despite the limp in her left leg, stood in the November rain and looked at the number on the mailbox, 414. The way you look at something you are committing to memory, because you understand, somewhere below the level of thought, that you will not be standing here again. She did not cry. She had done her crying the night before, alone in the bathroom with the tap running so no one would hear. She was from a generation that understood the difference between feeling something and displaying it, and she had felt in that bathroom the full weight of 53 years in this house, and then she had washed her face, and she had gone to bed. Now she picked up her suitcase. She had called the number on the brochure herself, because she would not give them the satisfaction of arranging even that. The taxi, when it came back, had a pine tree air freshener and a radio playing something she didn't recognize. The driver didn't speak. She was grateful. Harlow Creek, Virginia, is situated in a fold of the Appalachian foothills, approximately 40 miles southwest of Roanoke, in an area of the state that seems to have been largely overlooked by the 21st century. The town has a post office, 2 churches, a hardware store that doubles as a feed supply, and a diner called Patsy's where the coffee is too strong and the pie is transcendent. The population, according to the sign at the edge of town, is 2,241. However, anyone who has lived there for more than a decade will tell you that the number hasn't been updated since the last census, and it was generous even then. In late autumn, Harlow Creek turns a color that photographers drive hours to find and can never quite capture, the particular amberandrust of a Virginia hillside when the oaks are the last ones holding their leaves, and the sky goes that specific shade of pewter that means winter is not coming. Winter is already here, standing just outside the door. The air smells of wood smoke and cold mud, and something sweet and slightly rotten from the apple trees that nobody tends anymore in the orchard on Millbrook Road. The Granger house stood on Sycamore Hill, at the end of a gravel lane that the county had stopped maintaining sometime in the mid-90s. It was a large house by Harlow Creek standards, 4 bedrooms, 2 full baths, a wraparound porch that had been beautiful once and was merely functional now, its boards gone silver and soft in places where the winters had worked their way in. Harold Granger had built the back addition himself in 1987, taking 3 summers to do what a contractor might have done in 4 months, but doing it with the particular care of a man who understood that a thing done slowly is done only once. The garden had been Eleanor's. In its prime, it had been the kind of garden that made strangers slow their cars, roses along the south fence, a kitchen garden in the back that produced more tomatoes than any family could eat, a border of lavender that hummed with bees from June through September. Now, with Harold 14 months gone and Eleanor increasingly unwelcome in the decisions being made about the property, the garden had been allowed to go to seed. Douglas had hired someone to mow, but mowing is not tending, and the roses had gone woody and the lavender had not been cut back, and the kitchen garden was a rectangle of dead stems and something that might have been a volunteer tomato plant, still trying. The house itself had been in Harold's family since 1952. His parents had bought it for $11,000 and considered themselves lucky. Harold had been born in the front bedroom. He had come home to die in it, too, though they had moved the hospital bed to the living room in those last weeks because Harold had wanted to see the porch, and Eleanor had wanted him to have whatever he wanted. Eleanor Nell Granger had been born Eleanor Whitmore in Charlottesville, Virginia, in 1947, the second of 3 children, in a family that was genteel in the old Southern way that means proud and not very practical with money. Her father sold insurance. Her mother gave piano lessons in the front room. There was always enough and never quite comfort, and Eleanor had grown up understanding that you made do with what you had, and you did not make it anyone else's problem. She had married Harold Granger in June of 1971 at the First Methodist Church in Harlow Creek, in a dress her mother had made from a pattern in a McCall's catalog. She was 23. He was 26 and so nervous during the ceremony that he put the ring on the wrong hand, and they had both laughed, and that laugh, surprised and genuine and slightly scandalized, had set the tone for 52 years. She had been many things inside that marriage: a bookkeeper for a decade at the Harlow Creek Hardware before Douglas was born, a 4-H leader, a reliable presence at the Methodist Church potluck, known specifically for a green bean casserole that was requested by name. She had nursed Harold through a bypass surgery in 2004, and a hip replacement in 2016, with the same practical tenderness she brought to everything. And she had sat with him through the final weeks of the pancreatic cancer that came for him in January of last year, with the efficiency of someone who had been planning this for a long time. She wore her white hair pinned back every morning with a tortoiseshell clip she'd bought at a drugstore in 1989 and somehow never lost. Her hands were rough, the kind of rough that comes from decades of soil and dish soap and cold mornings in a garden, and she was self-conscious of them in a mild way that she recognized as vanity and had mostly made peace with. She walked with a slight limp from a fall she'd taken on the icy back steps in 2019, the week of Harold's 80th birthday party, when she'd been carrying a tray of deviled eggs and had gone down hard and quietly and gotten up before anyone saw because there were guests and deviled eggs to worry about. She laughed at things other people didn't notice, a bird doing something improbable on the feeder, an unintentional rhyme in the evening news, the particular expression of a dog being told no. It was a quiet laugh, not performed, the laugh of a person who finds the world genuinely amusing rather than one who is demonstrating that they find the world genuinely amusing. She had trusted her family completely. Not naively, she was not a naive woman. She had simply, over the course of her life, found that trust freely given is more sustainable than trust withheld, and she had extended this to Douglas the way you extend faith in the direction where faith seems most warranted by history and love and 52 years of being someone's mother. This, as it turned out, was the most costly decision of her life. And she had made it with her eyes open, which made it cost more, not less. Douglas Granger was 54 years old, heavy-set in the way of men who were athletic in their 30s and then got busy, with his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, and neither of their dispositions. He had left Harlow Creek at 18 for Virginia Tech, come back briefly after college, and then left again for Richmond, where he had spent the last 2 decades developing commercial real estate with the particular energy of a man who had discovered that the world rewards confident people and has decided to become one. He was not without affection for his mother. He called on Sundays, or meant to. He had cried at his father's funeral, genuinely, in a way that surprised even him. But Douglas had also, over the past several years, come to think of his parents' house the way developers tend to think of properties, in terms of potential unrealized, of value trapped in sentiment, of what something could be if it were handled correctly. The house sat on 4 acres. The back 40 could be subdivided. The location, while not prime, was exactly the kind of thing that Richmond buyers looking for a weekend property were starting to explore. His wife Pamela, 51, had grown up in McLean, Virginia, in a house where the carpets were cream-colored and there were no dogs allowed on the furniture, and she ran her household in Henrico County with an efficiency that was admirable if you were outside it and quietly suffocating if you were in it. She had never been unkind to Eleanor in any single demonstrable moment. She had been unkind in the aggregate, in the way a person can be cold without ever doing anything cold, the way a room can be unwelcoming without any single element being wrong. Their daughter Kayla, 28, had her mother's certainty and her father's energy, and was at the age where she had not yet had occasion to discover that the world would, at some point, require something from her that she could not simply produce with confidence and a good phone signal. The process of edging Eleanor out had been gradual enough that it was almost possible to miss, the way you miss the shortening of days in September, until one afternoon you look up and it's dark at 6. Eleanor's things had been moved from the living room shelves to make space for Pamela's taste. Her opinion at dinner had been solicited less and less and then not at all. When she mentioned that the garden needed attention, Douglas had said he would handle it and then handled it by hiring someone to mow. The papers came on a Tuesday. Douglas presented them at the kitchen table with the manner of a man delivering a logical conclusion, which is how he experienced it. The house was to be sold. It made financial sense, the maintenance costs, the property taxes, the fact that a woman of Eleanor's age living alone was a liability. He had arranged a room at Maplewood Senior living in Roanoke. He said the word arranged, as though it were a kindness, which, in his own understanding of the moment, it was. Eleanor had 48 hours. She had sat at the kitchen table where she had eaten 10,000 meals and looked at her son's face and understood that he had thought about this conversation very carefully and had prepared for several versions of it and had not prepared for silence. She was quiet for a long time. Then she asked if she could have until the morning to pack. He said, of course. Pamela from the doorway said nothing. She packed 1 suitcase. Harold's wristwatch went first, a Timex he had worn since 1978, the crystal slightly scratched, the second hand still moving with that quiet insistence of things that outlast their owners. She had taken it from his wrist at the hospital and had not put it down in any permanent sense since, and she set it on top of the folded clothes in the Samsonite with the deliberateness of a woman arranging an altar. The recipe box, wooden, painted green, the latch a little loose, containing 300 index cards in her own handwriting spanning 50 years of meals, the green bean casserole, Harold's mother's pound cake, a risotto she had learned from a magazine in 1994 and modified over 23 years into something that bore only philosophical resemblance to the original. These were not recipes to her, they were a record. The photograph from the honeymoon was tucked inside a book, a paperback copy of To Kill a Mockingbird she had read 4 times. In the photograph, she and Harold were standing in front of Niagara Falls, both of them squinting into the sun, Harold's arm around her shoulders, her head tipped slightly toward him. She was 23 years old in that photograph and looked it. Harold was grinning in the way he grinned when he was very happy and slightly overwhelmed, and she had loved that grin for 52 years, and she loved it still, which is the strange grammar of grief, present tense, permanently. She did not take the china, she did not take the silver her mother had left her. She did not take the quilts she had made over 20 years of winter evenings. Some of this was because there was no room. Some of it was something harder to name, a refusal, perhaps, to carry more than she could hold. She did not cry in front of them. Maplewood Senior Living was a 40-minute drive from Harlow Creek, on a commercial strip in northwest Roanoke between a tire shop and a medical supply store. The building was brick, 1-story, with a parking lot that was always mostly full and a small garden near the entrance that had plastic flowers in November, which Eleanor noted without comment. The room they showed her was on the east wing, number 14, with a single window that looked directly onto the parking lot and a thin mattress on a metal-framed bed, and a dresser that smelled of institutional cleaner and decades of other people's belongings. She thanked the woman who showed her in. She set her suitcase on the bed. She sat in the chair by the window and looked at the parking lot for a while, the coming and going of people who had somewhere to be, the December light already failing at 4 in the afternoon, and then she got up and asked the woman at the front desk where the nearest garden center was. She bought a pot of rosemary and a pot of thyme and set them on the windowsill. They caught what light there was. Within a week, her room smelled like a kitchen. Rosa Delgado, 81, was in room 12. She had taught 5th grade in Roanoke for 31 years and had the manner of a woman who has spent decades making children feel simultaneously corrected and loved, which is a specific and rare skill. She knocked on Eleanor's door 3 days after Eleanor arrived and asked if she played cards. Eleanor said she did not play cards well. Rosa said that was fine, she would teach her. By the end of the first week, they were playing gin rummy every afternoon at 2 o'clock, and by the end of the second week, this had become non-negotiable. Eleanor did not bounce back. She did not recover in the way people recover from illness, making a visible return to a previous state. She continued, which is what people who have lived through genuine difficulty actually do. She continued the way water continues around a stone, not pretending the stone isn't there, simply finding the path forward and taking it with the quiet pragmatism of a thing that must move. The letter came on a Wednesday, 6 weeks after she moved in. It had been forwarded from the Sycamore Hill address. She had filed a change of address with the post office, but Douglas had gotten to the mail first on the day it arrived and had nearly thrown it out with the catalogs before something about the law firm's return address, Whitmore, Alcott and Dean, 430 Park Avenue, New York, NY, had made him pause. He had forwarded it, though he would later be unable to say with clarity why. Perhaps residual conscience, perhaps carelessness. Perhaps the particular discomfort of a man who knows, somewhere below the level of his own willingness to look, that he has done something that cannot be entirely undone. The envelope was cream-colored and heavy, the kind of stationery that communicates, before you have opened it, that the people who sent it do not economize on paper. Her name on the front, Mrs. Eleanor Granger née Whitmore. The née caught her eye first. Nobody had used that formulation in decades. Inside, 3 pages of dense legal language and then a cover letter, signed by a man named Arthur Alcott, senior partner, who wrote with the directness of someone who has delivered both very good news and very bad news many times, and has learned that clarity is the most humane approach. Her uncle, Edward Whitmore, had died 26 months ago in Greenwich, Connecticut, at the age of 88. He had never married. He had no children. He had, beginning in 1979 with $12,000 and an office above a laundromat in Midtown Manhattan, built a private equity firm, Whitmore Capital Partners, that had, over 4 decades of careful and somewhat legendary work, accumulated assets that at the time of his death were valued at $514 million. He had left all of it to Eleanor. There was a letter from Edward himself, written 2 years before his death and notarized in the manner of a man who understood that lawyers required evidence of intention. It was 3 paragraphs. Eleanor read it twice before she fully understood she was reading it. He had remembered her, he wrote, every day of his adult life, not in a sentimental way, but in the way you remember a thing that reoriented you. He had been 19 years old and stranded in Charlottesville after a disagreement with their father in 1954, with no money and nowhere to go. Eleanor, who was 7 at the time and had a habit of keeping her allowance in a small tin box shaped like a barn, had given him her entire savings, $20, without being asked and without, as far as he could tell, expecting anything in return. She had simply given it because he needed it. He had used those $20 to buy a bus ticket to New York. The rest, he wrote, was a long story. He hoped she would find a use for what he left her. He was sorry they had lost touch. He had not known, when the argument that separated their families escalated into years of silence, how to find his way back. He suspected she would understand this. He suspected she understood most things. The family argument, Eleanor sat now trying to remember, had been about something, their father's will, or a perceived slight at a Christmas dinner, or possibly both, the way these things are usually both and also neither. She had not thought of Edward in years. She had not known he was wealthy. She had not known, when she gave him that $20 in 1954, that she was giving it to a future titan of private equity, because no one knows what 19-year-olds will become, and besides, that had not been the point. The estate, after taxes and administrative fees, $514 million, pending her formal acceptance and verification of identity. She read the letter 3 times. She called the number from the phone at the nurse's station, because her cell phone reception in room 14 was unreliable. Arthur Alcott answered on the second ring. He was 68 years old and had a voice that belonged to someone who had been delivering consequential news for 4 decades and had learned to be neither theatrical nor rushed about it. He confirmed everything in the letter. He expressed what appeared to be genuine relief that she had been located. They had spent 2 years searching, he said, working from an address in Harlow Creek that had produced no response. He asked how she was. "I'm at a senior living facility," she told him, in Roanoke. There was a brief pause that she recognized as a man recalibrating. He asked if she had legal representation. She said she did not. He said he would like to come to Virginia in person to walk her through the process, if she was agreeable. She said she supposed she was. She hung up the phone, returned to her room, and sat in the chair by the window. The parking lot was doing what parking lots do: people arriving, people leaving, a truck idling near the dumpsters for reasons that were unclear. The rosemary on the windowsill was flourishing in a way that seemed, in this particular moment, almost pointed. She sat there for the better part of an hour. Rosa found her at 3:45, when Eleanor had not appeared for their 2 o'clock gin rummy, which was unprecedented. Rosa knocked and then opened the door. They had that kind of friendship already, the kind built quickly by people who have run out of time for the slow version, and found Eleanor in the chair, very still, holding a letter. "Nell," she said, "what's happened?" It was not entirely a question. Eleanor handed her the letter. Rosa read it with the focused attention of a former schoolteacher, which is to say she read every word and did not skip anything, and finished before she commented. Then she set it on her knee and looked out the window for a moment. "Well," Rosa said. "Yes," Eleanor said. They sat in the silence for a bit, the kind of silence that 2 women who have each buried a husband understand differently from other people. Then Rosa said, quietly, in the voice she had once used to tell children hard truths about fractions and the nature of effort. Harold would have said it figures. Eleanor made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, and was both. She felt in the days that followed no triumph. What she felt was a complicated grief with several branches. For Harold, who was not here, who had worked carefully and quietly for decades and would have known exactly what to do with this news and exactly what to say, and who was not here to say it. For the family she had believed she had, not the one that existed, but the one she had understood herself to have, which had turned out to be a building she had been decorating from the inside, while the walls were made of something far less permanent than she knew. For Edward, a 19-year-old boy she had given $20 to, and then lost to the carelessness of family argument and the accumulation of years, who had carried her kindness like a compass for 66 years, and had managed, in the end, to find his way back to her by the only route still open. She was not triumphant. She was, more than anything, very tired and very awake at the same time, which is a specific state that usually means something important is about to begin. Arthur Alcott arrived in Roanoke on a Thursday morning in a rental car because he had driven from the airport himself, rather than hearing a car service, which Eleanor found quietly telling. He was a tall man going gray in a way that looked distinguished rather than diminished, with the unhurried manner of someone who has stopped needing to prove things. He had expected she could tell, someone who might be overwhelmed. He had not expected Nell Granger. He had not expected the rosemary on the windowsill, or the gin rummy cards stacked neatly on the dresser, or the way she poured him a cup of coffee from the small maker she had acquired in her second week at Maplewood and said, "It's not great, but I've learned to treat that as a character-building exercise." He liked her immediately. The legal process, he explained, would take several weeks to initiate formally. There was a verification process, standard in estates of this size, and then the transfer of assets in stages, and various administrative requirements that he outlined with the patience of a man who has explained these things many times, but understands that this particular time is not interchangeable with the others. Eleanor listened carefully and asked questions that he later described to his associate in New York as the best questions I've been asked in 30 years of estate law. Douglas found out on a Tuesday, 2.5 weeks after Arthur's first visit, when the law firm contacted him regarding a financial complication that had arisen from the estate's review. The family home, which Douglas had already sold, the contract signed, the closing scheduled for February, had been mortgaged against Harold's name in a transaction from 2003 that Douglas had not known about, or said he had not known about, which had produced what Arthur described to Eleanor as a situation requiring some untangling. It was not, in the end, a complication that could not be resolved, but it was one that could not be resolved without Eleanor's cooperation, which meant that Douglas now needed something from his mother that his mother was under no obligation to provide. He called twice before he came in person. Eleanor listened to the messages and did not return them. On the third Friday of December, Douglas Granger drove to Maplewood Sr., living in northwest Roanoke, and asked at the front desk for his mother. She met him in the common room. The common room at Maplewood had orange carpet, fluorescent lighting, and chairs upholstered in a shade of green that had been chosen, apparently, by someone who had never needed to sit in it for very long. It smelled of old coffee and something floral from a plug-in air freshener near the television. Rosa Delgado was sitting in the far corner with a library copy of a Ruth Rendell mystery and the particular quality of stillness that means a person is paying very close attention to something other than the book in their lap. Douglas looked large in the room and somehow smaller than usual at the same time. He was wearing a coat she didn't recognize, new, expensive, the kind of coat a man buys when he is doing well and wants that to be visible, and he had the careful expression of someone who has rehearsed this and is now discovering that the rehearsal was insufficient. He said her name. She gestured to the chair across from her. He sat, he tried several beginnings and abandoned each of them, which she watched without rushing him. He said that he had not understood the full picture. He said that the decision about the house had been made with what he thought were her best interests in mind. He said, and here something in his face shifted into something that might have been the real thing, that he had not expected this, any of this, meaning the law firm and the estate and the strange turned-over quality of the past few weeks. Then he said, I thought there was nothing ahead for you. I thought the best thing was to simplify. He had meant it as a mitigating factor. It landed as a confession. She looked at him for a long time. He was her son, and she could see Harold's jaw in his face, and she could see the boy who had broken his arm falling from the oak tree in 1978 and had cried into her shoulder with a total unguarded trust that he had never quite gotten back to. And she loved him the way you love someone who has disappointed you so thoroughly that the love and the disappointment have become one complicated fact that you simply carry. Douglas, she said, I know you thought that. She let it sit. He waited for more. She did not offer more. The mortgage situation will be resolved, she said, finally. Arthur will be in touch with your attorney. You don't need to worry about the closing. She folded her hands in her lap. But I want you to hear me say this once so that it's been said. I was your mother for 54 years. I made your birthday cakes, and I sat up with you when you had pneumonia, and I drove you to every baseball practice for 6 years, even though I do not understand baseball, and I have never understood baseball. I was nothing, and I was not finished, and I want you to know that I know that, even if you didn't. Douglas opened his mouth. You can go now, she said. He went. Rosa from the corner set down her book. She reached across the space between their chairs. It was a stretch, and put her hand over Eleanor's. Eleanor turned her hand over and held it. They sat there until the coffee got cold. Eleanor Granger formally accepted the inheritance on the 14th of January. She was 77 years old, and it was a Tuesday, which seemed to her like the right kind of day for something like this, not a Friday, which carries the artificial drama of a week's ending, not a Monday, which carries everyone's projections about beginnings. Tuesday, a working day, a day for getting things done. She did not buy a mansion. She did not take a cruise. She did not, in any dramatic gesture, confront the family or hire lawyers to make anyone's life difficult, though she could have, and Arthur had gently noted that she could have. The first thing she did was call Maplewood's administrator and arrange a meeting. She donated $400,000 to the facility, specifically for the renovation of the residents' rooms, new mattresses, new windows, better lighting, and the replacement of the orange carpet with something that, she said to the administrator, a person might actually want to walk on. She requested that the parking lot facing rooms be given priority for window upgrades. She did not attach her name to any of it. She established a scholarship at Harlow Creek Regional High School in Harold's name, the Harold James Granger Memorial Scholarship, full 4-year tuition, renewable, awarded annually to a student demonstrating practical intelligence and persistence in the face of difficulty, because those had been Harold's defining qualities, and they were qualities she wanted the world to keep producing. She found the house in North Carolina through a real estate agent in Wilmington, a small white house on Topsail Island, 3 bedrooms, a porch that faced the ocean, a yard with 2 live oak trees, and enough space for a garden. She and Harold had talked about the Outer Banks the way people talk about the life they'll have eventually, meaning the life they intend to have but keep postponing because the present always has its own requirements. She bought the house in February, cash, and spent March having it repainted and a new kitchen put in. She asked Rosa if she would come. Rosa said she had been waiting to be asked since December. They moved in the first week of April, when the island was still quiet before the season, and the ocean was the gray-green color of deep cold, and the air tasted of salt and distance. Rosa brought 4 boxes of books and a philodendron she had kept alive for 11 years and was not leaving behind. Eleanor brought the Samsonite, the recipe box, Harold's watch, the honeymoon photograph, and the potted rosemary and thyme, which had by April become robust enough to count as small shrubs. Maya Ockafer was 24 years old and lived 8 minutes away in a rented house with her 2 children, ages 3 and 5, and was working 2 jobs, cashier at a grocery store and evening cleaner at a medical office, and had exactly 0 spare hours in her week, and had been doing this for 2 years since her husband left, with the focused endurance of a person who has decided that endurance is available to her whether or not anything else is. Eleanor found her through a flyer at the island's community center. She paid her 3 times the market rate for part-time household help, with health insurance and a retirement contribution, because Eleanor had done the math of what it cost to be 24 and alone with children in this particular country and had found the math obscene. Maya cried when Eleanor laid out the terms. Eleanor pretended not to notice, which was its own form of kindness. Arthur Alcott became, over the following months, a genuine friend in the manner of 2 people who discover late in life that the world has been holding back an acquaintance they needed. He was methodical and precise, where Eleanor was intuitive, formal, and plain-spoken, and they were, she once told Rosa, exactly the kind of people who should not get along and therefore got along perfectly. They corresponded by letter. Eleanor preferred it, and Arthur, who had grown up in a household where letters were the primary form of nonverbal communication, found that he preferred it too, once he remembered how. He wrote on cream stationery. She wrote on yellow legal paper in a handwriting that was clear and a little old-fashioned and entirely her own. Douglas wrote twice. The first letter came in April, 3 pages, carefully structured, more articulate than she had expected. She read it and set it aside and did not respond. The second came in June, shorter, less structured, which she recognized as the difference between the letter a man writes when he has consulted a lawyer and the letter he writes when he hasn't. She read it too. She set it aside too. Kayla called on a Thursday in May. Eleanor answered. Grandma, Kayla said, with the particular tone of someone who has thought carefully about what to call the person they have wronged. How are you? I'm well, Eleanor said. How are you? They talked for 4 minutes. Eleanor asked about Kayla's job. She worked in marketing in Richmond, and Kayla asked about the house, having seen it, presumably in some way Eleanor didn't investigate. Eleanor said it was comfortable. Kayla said she was glad. There was a pause that neither of them filled, and then Eleanor said, in a voice that was neither warm nor cold but simply matter of fact, I need to go now. Take care of yourself. She hung up. Rosa, from the kitchen where she was making tea, did not comment. This was one of Rosa's greatest gifts. There is a particular cruelty that operates below the level of drama, the cruelty of the ledger, of the person evaluated by what they currently hold rather than what they are. It is the cruelty that measures an old woman by the balance of an account she does not know she has, that looks at 77 years of a life and sees only the inconvenience of its continuation. We do this more than we admit. We do it to the elderly, who are considered inconvenient. We do it to the poor. We do it sometimes to ourselves, measuring our own worth by the tally of the present moment, forgetting that a life is not a snapshot but a long accumulation, and that the accumulation does not stop until it stops. Eleanor had given her uncle $20 in 1954 from a tin box shaped like a barn because he was 19 and stranded and needed it. She had not thought about it again, or not much, not in the way that becomes a story. She had thought, here is a person who needs something I have. She had given it, that was the whole of it. And that $20 had become, through the alchemy of time and a good man's memory and 66 years of compound interest in the only currency that never fully devalues, the currency of being seen and remembered as a person who was genuinely kind, $514 million. This is not a story about money. The money is just the form the story took. The story is about the $20 and what it meant that she gave it without expectation and without memory, because she was simply that kind of person. We spend a great deal of our lives believing that generosity is a transaction, that if we give without return, we have lost something. Eleanor Granger had not believed this. She had believed in the practical, unsentimental way of a woman who gardened and cooked and raised a child and nursed a husband and outlasted most of what she had been given to outlast, that you put good into the world the way you put seeds in the ground, not knowing what winter would do to them, not auditing the soil for promise, just putting them in because that is what seeds are for. The particular dignity of a woman at 77 is not the dignity of a completed life. It is the dignity of a continuing one. Eleanor Granger at 77 was not a chapter that had closed, not a story that had reached its natural resolution, not a person whose narrative had arrived, with her husband's death and her gardens dying and her son's papers on the kitchen table, at its graceful decline. She was a person in the middle of something. She had been in the middle of something her entire life, because that is what being alive means. You are always in the middle, until suddenly you're not, and in the meantime, the middle is the whole of it, and the middle is enough. The family that claimed her discarded her. The family she built, Rosa with her books and her philodendron, Maya with her children and her relentless endurance, Arthur with his cream stationery and his careful letters, the ghost of Harold with his watch on her wrist and his name on a scholarship and his grin in a photograph taken at Niagara Falls in 1971. This was the family that held her. Not because of blood, which is an accident, but because of choice, which is everything. On the porch of the White House on Topsail Island, in the last hour of a September afternoon, Eleanor Granger sat in a wooden chair she had bought at a yard sale and painted herself the particular blue of the ocean on a clear day. Harold's watch was on her wrist, its second hand moving with the same quiet insistence it had moved with since 1978. Rosa was asleep in the chair beside her, the philodendron visible through the window in the living room, a library book open and face down on her lap. In the yard under the live oaks, Maya's children were doing what small children do in yards when the light is gold, and there is no particular agenda, running towards something, running away from something, discovering, with the full seriousness of the very young, that the world is large and interesting and contains within it, if you look, an inexhaustible supply of things worth running toward. The ocean was doing what oceans do. Eleanor watched it for a long time, not thinking anything in particular, or thinking everything in the undifferentiated way of a person who has got to a place where thinking and being have become, for now, the same thing. She was not finished. She was not done. She was right here.